This is part 1 of Unit 5, and as you can kind of see here on the board, the title of the board is Dealing with the New America. So in essence, America has changed. It's changed because we're becoming industrialized. It's changed because of the market revolution. And so we want to look at now how those things changed America. And so that's pretty important. Okay, we always want to look at cause and effects and what made us kind of like we are today. And so with those two events, pretty much we see a change in America and how many Americans are living. One thing to keep in mind as we go forward is the fact that much of the stuff that we're going to talk about here, the changes we're going to discuss, are primarily happening in the North and to some degree in the West. In the South, remember, they have a very established way of life. They're fighting, they're clinging to that way of life. They don't want that way of life to end. They like it, at least most of the people do. And so they're not going to see a lot of the changes that we're talking about. That won't happen until we have the Civil War and they're forced to change when they lose. So just kind of keep that in mind. One of the things is tremendous growth, okay? Growth in population, and especially in American cities. And the main reason for that, as you can see here, is there is an influx or surge of immigrants. And immigrants are coming from different parts of the world for the same reason most people come to America, and that's for a better life, primarily economic opportunities. But most of the people that are coming here are coming for better economic opportunities. Most of them, as you can see, are German or Irish, and to some degree on the West Coast here we're going to have Chinese, which of course is a change, but that gives you an indication that the west part of the United States is now starting to be developed as well. Remember, we have the Louisiana Purchase. That part has been explored, and we'll talk a little bit more about that part of the country as we get towards the end of this unit. But let's go back to German and especially Irish. Okay, the Irish are coming in huge waves, as you might imagine, because of the potato famine. And many of them are coming for a new, fresh start. And America promises that. And they're going to have kind of a hard time because they don't fit in so well, primarily because they're Catholic, and most of the people in America are Protestants. And at those times, Catholics and Protestants don't get along very well, and there's often fights. And of course, the Irish have the stereotype that, you know, they are kind of drunkard and fighters, and they fight that as well, no pun intended. Okay, but again, just kind of have an idea of why the people are coming, but primarily they're coming for the new opportunities the country offers them. A chance to start over, a chance at a better life. One of the things that we don't understand is most of the other places in the world, land was very hard to get. It was owned by the privileged few, and they had held it for generations, passed down from father to son and so forth. It was very hard to own your own land in places like Ireland, or even England and France and Europe in general, because the land was owned by other people. Here in America, there was plenty of land. It was fairly cheap, and so they're coming to start over and you know, start afresh and hopefully make a better life for themselves. They encounter something very quickly called nativism, and I'll show you some clips about this in class. But nativism is prejudice against immigrants. There was a big group of Americans that didn't like them, primarily because they're taking American jobs and they're lowering wages. They're willing to work for less, and that's not good for the Native Americans or the people in America that were born here. Not Indian Native Americans, but Americans that were born and raised in this country. And so they faced a lot of prejudice and often hostility. And by hostility I mean violence. There was anger, and you'll see that pretty clearly in the clips that I'll show you. To counteract that, to protect themselves against that, they often formed their own neighborhoods in these large cities, like Chinatown is the most obvious example. But you'd have Little Italy or Polish Hill or you know, Swedetown. Any of these nationalities would often bond together in a neighborhood to, you know, protect themselves and to make a little home away from home, and they would feel comfortable there because they had a lot of the same customs and beliefs and practices, and they wouldn't face the nativism that they would face you know, in the rest of the city. And so they would often form these for their own protection. These people are also living in very horrid conditions. Most of the cities don't have sewers or garbage collections. Most of them are providing very poor, inadequate, rat-infested housing. Disease is very common. They don't know much about hygiene. They don't understand about, you need to clean up the garbage so that you don't have rats and disease and germs being spread. And so it was very dirty and very smelly. And often these people were cramped together, shoved in very tight quarters, and lived in very poor parts of the city. And we'll get to a little bit more of that again when you see some of the clips and so forth. This is kind of illustrated a little bit more clearly if you look on page 426 in your book. On there you'll find a map or graph that shows how quickly the cities are growing, and how from 1820 to 1860, how sometimes they're doubling or more in size. Now we're fairly familiar with that here in our hometown because we're growing fairly quickly, and we know what's happening here with the housing crunch and the increased traffic. Well, now imagine it back in the mid-1800s, where they don't have the mechanical means to build things as fast as we can today. And you can understand maybe how this would put a really push or squeeze on the resources that they had. And so this rapid urban growth led to a lot of problems because the city planners and the contractors and stuff, they just couldn't build things fast enough to keep up with how fast the things were growing. One of the things about the growing cities too is it really showed the huge gap between the rich and the poor now. Of course, there's usually a gap between the rich and poor, but now with the rise of industry, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And this was pretty evident by where you lived in a town. There was always poor parts of town that you don't want to live in, and if you live there, everyone knows you're on the wrong side of the tracks, as the saying goes. And the rich people could afford to move away from all the ugliness and get into nicer living quarters and stuff like that. The most obvious or best example is the largest city in New York had a place called 5 Points, which is one of the worst places to live. And this is where the video clips I'm going to show you are from. And it's just a huge, huge slum, rundown area where these immigrants from all different places were shoved together. And it was very, very dirty and violent and cramped and confusing. It was just very, very awkward and not a really good place to live. And that's where many of them were living. And statistics will show about 70% of the people living in these cities were very, very poor, just scraping or eking out an existence. So even though we had a middle class that had developed, most of the people living in these cities wouldn't fit in the upper or middle class. Again, about 70% of them are going to be the poor. Okay? Again, the cities are going to lack this adequate housing needed. The housing are going to be smushed together. No sewers, no garbage collecting. So just kind of picture in your head a very dirty, odorous, dingy, packed area, and that's what 5 Points would be. And then you throw in the poor health conditions that these people are living in, and you can imagine why you're going to have some disease problems. So epidemics were common. The worst one was the yellow fever epidemic that happened again in the mid-1800s that took thousands of lives. And again, part of that is they don't understand hygiene, they don't have the proper medicine, they don't understand about nutrition and these kinds of things. But part of it is too, they're just not eating very well, they're working long hours, so they're physically drained, and they're living really cramped together in here, and all kind of combines. But that's an important aspect to remember. I'm just trying to kind of paint a picture of what it's like to live at this time, and it's not a pretty one. Usually when it's ugly like that, people often turn to crime because they see crime as their only way of escape. Only if I steal and rob and do illegal things can I escape this poor poverty condition. If I work in a factory, I'm always going to be stuck there. No matter how hard I work, I'm not going to pull myself out of this area and have a decent life. But if I do illegal things, I can. And violence is very common too, because these people get frustrated. And you can imagine if you're in a place that's hot and smelly and you're smushed together and crowded, you can imagine how that's going to wear on you after a while. And violence would not be unheard of. In fact, it was very, very common at this time, and we'll get a little bit more on that in this slide here as well. As far as the culture, what was it like to be living at this time? What kind of things were they doing? Something that surprisingly or might surprise you is they were reading a lot. And even though a lot of these people couldn't read, somebody in the local tavern or shops would be able to read, and everyone would hear these stories. And some of the first, some famous Americans had their first stories printed here. Walt Whitman and Edgar Allan Poe, two famous names you've probably heard of. And they would have their articles or stories printed in these papers, and they were very, very popular. And one of the things that Edgar Allan Poe did, you might know he developed the mystery story, and what he would do is he would do it in a serial form. So every week you'd have to buy the newspaper to find out the next part of the story, just so you could see what happens. And that was very popular, and a very popular form of entertainment as well. So newspapers are becoming even more popular, even among the common people. And you can see penny means they're very, well, relatively inexpensive. Other things that were very common in the cities: parades, dances, marches. In other words, things that are fairly cheap to do, things that don't take a lot of money, and they're ways for the common people to blow off the steam. You work that hard all the time, you don't want to go home to your poor, cramped, smelly, dirty area. You want to go and have a little fun. You want to blow off some steam. You want to forget about your troubles. And so they would do simple things, you know, like here, I remember sometimes, you know, people having street dances or barn dances. Those kinds of things would be very similar. Rodeos, that might be something similar today. But these were often very rowdy. People would get intoxicated, and people would start fights. Might be between natives and immigrants. It might be between upper and lower class. But the point being, there was a lot of people out milling about in the streets, and they got rowdy and out of control quite often. Okay? So much so that the wealthier people in particular started to get concerned about what's happening to their city, and a little concerned about their property. And what this led to is the first full-time police. Up until this time, police and fire departments were usually voluntary. And so, you know, what would happen if there was a crime or something, you'd get a posse of good old boys together, and you'd go take care of the problem, and then everyone would go back to their regular jobs. And you might have one or two people that was like the sheriff or the county police or whatever. But now we have municipal police or city police, because the violence was so extreme and so common. There was a demand that we need to have a permanent group designed to keep law and order and peace. And that gives you an idea of how bad it must have been. Okay, a couple more on that as well. There was a lot of prejudice to go around at this time. It was not a time where everyone got along, and not really the great American melting pot as sometimes is portrayed, where we absorb people and welcome people from all nations. Not really the picture. There's prejudice against poor people. The rich people would turn up their noses, wouldn't want to have anything to do with them, think the poor people are a lower class, inferior class, not worthy of their time. These kind of things. Catholics and Protestants, as I mentioned before, did not get along. There would be violence there. But probably the biggest group, or the group that was targeted the most, was blacks. And I'm talking about free blacks here because, again, we're talking primarily the North and the South. Free blacks often worked for less, and so they were often targeted for that reason. They were also targeted because there wasn't very many of them. They were a minority, and they were easy to pick on. And again, violence was just common, and they were a group that was often around that you could pick on, and they were probably the target of the most prejudicial violence. Oftentimes, there was rioting in the streets. So people didn't just have fights at dances or marches or parades. They had just fights where people were just angry about something, and they marched through the street and just destroy buildings and shops and beat people up and all these kinds of things. And these were very, very common. I have the city of Philly here. That was the worst one, and it's probably not a coincidence that Philly had the largest population of free blacks. And so there was often rioting there and fighting on both sides. The blacks would retaliate as well, and thousands of people died during these years, again, roughly the mid-1800s, from all this violence. So that just shows you how bad it was. Okay? It was a very common occurrence. So kind of just to sum up, life in America, in the cities at this time, they're exploding. The population is just going through the roof. And that's primarily because immigrants are coming in looking for a better life. And you might remember they took the jobs at Lowell, for example, from the women. And so that leads to all kinds of anxiety and hostility, which usually leads to violence of some sort. And these people are working hard hours, low pay, living in horrible conditions, and that's kind of what the cities were like. You have the rich, and then you have a smaller group of middle class, and then you have the poor. Remember, most of the people were poor, and they worked these long, horrible days with very physical, demanding labor with very little to show for it. And that's kind of what the cities are like, and that'll end part 1.